The way rock objects are populated onto surfaces has changed in version 10.5. So what we're going to take a look at first is exactly how the rocks would populate onto surfaces and the normal in previous versions of Vue. And we're going to be using version 10 to take a look at this, and versions prior to that with the other rock systems also worked the same way. So what I'm going to do is add in just a plane and kind of rotate it towards the camera a bit. And now we can see a nice angle here in the side view. And I'm just going to open up and edit the material for the plane, add ecosystem, and add a rock. And just go ahead and use from the rough rocks the iron rock. And I'm going to go ahead and just hit populate. And I'm going to switch the quality over to the smooth shaded mode. And now if we take a look in the side view, what we can see is that the instances are populated basically at the center of the rock. So the center of the rock touches the normal. So if we wanted to have the rocks resting on the surface, we would have to go into the density, set the offset from the surface proportional to the size of the instance, and increase that to 25-50% in order to raise them up above the surface and have them resting on it. This also means that the rotation, whether it's for the up axis only or all axes, is going to be performed around that pivot of the center. So if the instance is raised above and we're rotating, we have everything kind of rotating around the center of the object, and that's alright. The only problem is when we want to use some of the other rotation features like lean out at low density, it's still rotating in what would be leaning out from the center of the rock. So we really don't have the same kind of effect as we would with an ecosystem where we have things kind of falling off the edges of objects, and it doesn't really quite work as well. And it is going to be rotating around that offset pivot of the instance. If you go to the instance selector, we can see how high up the instance dots are off the surface. So it's going to rotate from each one of those pivots for each object. So now in version 10.5, I'm going to set up basically the same sort of scene, just adding a plane and rotating it towards the camera, and then editing the material, adding an ecosystem, and we'll go ahead and add this same type of rock. We'll use the iron rock, populate, and switch over the default quality to just smooth shaded to show the entire full quality and all the geometry. And now if we take a look, we can see that the objects and the rocks are populated, in this case just slightly above the normal. Normally you're going to be populating on terrains and objects with more variation than just a plane, so it'll typically intersect with the object correctly. If you do have it, like in this case where it's above the normal, the surface normal, you can go into the density proportional to the size of the instance for the offset from surface, and just decrease and set it to below the surface, maybe 20% or 10%, 15%, just to kind of sink it down a tiny bit. And that's if you have a very flat surface where there's, in this case, there's not a lot of changes between the slope, because it's just completely flat. So on a terrain, it's obviously going to intersect a little better. But another really cool thing about the way this is set up in 10.5 is now if we go over to the scaling and orientation and select to lean out at low densities, we can start having the rocks sort of fall over the edge of the object, because it's going to rotate around that pivot point on the surface normal. I'm going to go ahead and take the density and just turn off that below surface option. And we'll go ahead and increase the density a little bit too. But we can see the rocks now, once they reach the edge, kind of rotate and lean over the surface. So if we also want to embellish that a little bit and go into the lean out at low density and drive it with the function, we can set the value up to, say, 3. And then we really have the objects hanging over the edge and almost underneath it. So it's a really neat way to be able to control rocks now properly and really have them on top of the surface rather than inside of the surface. One thing to keep in mind when you're working with these new rocks now in their position is that the way the rotation is going to work, if we set it to the all axes mode, you'll probably see more rocks going underneath the object because the rotation is taking place underneath the rock. So just as it leans out around the edges in the all axes mode, it will intersect the normal quite a bit. So with the rocks, it's a good idea to kind of stay away from that if you want to have the rocks actually on the surface, because otherwise they're just intersecting and you really can't see them anyway. If you're worried about backwards compatibility, it is backwards compatible with the old rocks, and the positioning, if you had created a scene in a version of Vue prior to 10.5, I've just taken this scene from version 10 and saved it as rock population underscore Vue 10, and we're going to go ahead and load that into 10.5 and then take a look at how it works out. So here's that same scene in 10.5, and you can see that the population is centered as it was before. If we repopulate, it's going to stay centered. And the only difference we're going to see is the scale change, which is part of the overall ecosystem scale changes. And that will preserve the previous scale used in order to make sure that the scene retains its values properly. Now, if you need to, or you want to maybe update it so that it's populated with the new surface normal feature, you will need to remove the instance and the type, in this case of rock, from basically every ecosystem in the scene that is using that instance, and replace it with a new one, or add it back in. So we can delete the instance and re-add it, and now it's going to populate with the new surface normal directly on the surface normal feature.